Um, we can move on to our next speaker that we have here, who is George Davis. So he is a marketing coordinator and a worship director and has been living in the Grand Rapids area for quite a long time. So he has a lot of insight from his perspective in being in the community, and he's going to share that with us today. So thank you, George.
Yes, thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Sarah, as well. Much love and respect to my brothers, Derek, Devondre, Anthony, and Peter. I'm a Grand Rapids native, been here all of my life. First and foremost, I think before, I share my story, I always like to honor where I come from. And certainly I'm the son of George and Deborah, Jean Davis, Lafayette, and Cass is where my people come from. And my roots are in 914 Logan, but we moved a lot. Not a lot, but have been in different spaces in Grand Rapids. I grew up in a home where Black is beautiful was preached, and knowing who you are and whose you are were gravely important, and things that my parents instilled into me from a very, very early age. However, I think that also presented a significant amount of challenges growing up here in Grand Rapids, in that we consistently found ourselves occupying spaces where that was challenged, or us being in those spaces required us to relinquish a lot of times who we were at our core. That a lot of times our Blackness had to be put on the back burner for whether that be political or social reasons, and a lot of times cultural and religious reasons, because we are a Christian family and heavily involved in church and church spaces. And so I think that presented a significant amount of challenges for me growing up here in Grand Rapids in terms of my development and finding out who I was specifically as a Black man. So experiencing racism really came certainly in systemic and systematic ways and forms, and in implicit ways. Devondre spoke quite eloquently on that in the beginning of his talk about unconscious bias, but certainly implicit bias, and how systems and structures being in place and set up, and people using both their power and their privilege to control the outcomes of me and those who are close to me and in my family. Grew up in private school here with Peter Canusta, who's also on the call today. And so being there was always this tension of I'm Black, I'm in the space that is occupied majority by white people. And from all looks of it on the surface, my family, is the model, if you will, for Black family, 2-parent household, church going, good jobs, involved in the community, in places and spaces that we feel that are important. And so inside of that context, you find a lot of tokenization. And I think a lot of times we miss that level of how racism plays into our lives. We think that it has to be forceful, that it has to be being called out your name, but a lot of times just being given an opportunity or being presented in front of a group of Caucasian people as their, if you will, token Black person or person of color is highly detrimental to Black development, and is in a lot of ways using that power and privilege to control your outcomes. And so for me, I think that my journey has been about consistently rejecting that and using those times that I'm in those spaces to speak the truth about the Black experience and about being Black. So I could go on for a long time, but I think it's really been about navigating those spaces in a way where I can show up fully as myself. That the very presence of who I am as a Black man should make you uncomfortable, and you need to be uncomfortable with that. But I should not have to be uncomfortable in those spaces. Currently, Courtney kind of listed off some things in my bio. There are a lot of different opportunities that I have been presented with in terms of professionally spending most of my career in higher education, and now kind of working in public media and marketing. And so being a Black man in these spaces, it has always been my duty and my call personally to make sure that I am creating space for more people that look like me in the room at the table, that the organization that I work for, that it is outward facing, and that it truly represents the voice of the community, and not just of the majority of who we think are accessing it or involving themselves in it. And then also in the church space. I grew up with a father who is a musician. He was a worship director. He is now a pastor. I now fall in line in those footsteps. It has been a really full circle moment, even down to where I do that at my church. And with that being said, I think a lot of times, there's this notion of the separation of movement, social action, and then what we believe based upon tenets of our faith. And those things are not mutually exclusive. And so I want to put that out there, that the gospel and what happens in my faith tradition and also other people's faith tradition should promote you to action, should force you to want to do something about the injustices that we're experiencing and that we're seeing. And also calling those things out in those spaces, I think has been part of my lived experience that, at my church, in my community, if things aren't right or someone says something, I'm challenging those ways. And it happens in ways a lot of times that we don't see. I just had a conversation recently with some other worship leaders and people involved in church settings. Like, if we're going to really tackle this thing, it can't just be about talking it relationally, but like, how is this affected in the things that come across the pulpit? How is it affected in the songs that you choose to sing from Sunday to Sunday, or the artists or the songs that you raise up in a space to connect people to God and to their faith and to their experiences? Are those by white artists? Are those by Black artists? Are those by Latino artists? What does that look like? And examining all those things and saying, where have we done our people a disservice? Where have we held back information and experiences from them that could completely enrich them in a way only because we wanted to keep the status quo of being comfortable with the white majority in our presence. On the heels of that as well, too, our world was in turmoil, or at least we knew turmoil was coming, considering the administration that we entered and reluctantly welcomed back in 2016. And so in November of 2015, my wife and I started a business called Truth and Gold. And it really was our way of combating systemic racism and really controlling the narrative of how we wanted to be perceived and how we wanted, or the messages that we wanted to send to our children that we knew were coming and that we had just had in August. And I want to encourage people that the way that you go about fighting injustice, the most successful way to do that is to do it within line of your gifts, right? Like, it has to flow out of what you naturally do. And Nina Simone says that responsibility of an artist is to reflect, the voice of the times and the issues of the times. And so Truth and Gold was a way for us to do that. My wife is a sociologist by trade. She's an educator. And I've been very much a creative. And so we felt like merging those two worlds and putting together apparel that spoke truth into the lives of not only our brown boys, but also other Black and brown boys and girls and allies and parents, that we wanted to create a platform in order to do that. And so that has been another part, I think, of our journey. Some things that I feel like we are in terms of our current state of affairs, and what my call for white people to do is understand this. Do not call us into a space or ask us to occupy a space where we cannot be authentically Black and be ourselves. We are not monolithic in any way. And with that being said, I want to show up in a space and understand that I can be fully me. 2, code switching is out the door as a part of that. And I'm willing to share, I think we're all willing to share our experiences, but what we will not do as Black people is that we will not debate the validity of them with you as a white person. That in and of itself is racist, to have to defend that as a person of color and respect that part of my humanity. And then 2, if people are truly in a space of wanting to learn and wanting to access education from people of color, we cannot consistently expect it to happen without compensation. And so I know Derek mentioned, not giving rewards, but I want to push back on that a little bit, because all that is really taking someone's life work, their information, their lived experience, and saying, hey, give me that information for free, whether I choose or not to allow it to affect me at my core, is wrong and really is a perpetuation, if you will, in some ways of slavery, because you want labor, you want me to divulge and to put my pain on front without you honoring that in some type of way. A couple resources, and I can get to those after the questions if there are questions. I know I went over, my apologies, but yeah.
No, thank you so much for sharing, George. And a lot of people in the comments on Facebook and in the Q&A, they really liked what you talked about church and said that you're really authentic in that as well. And it looks like we have 1 minute to answer a question. So someone did ask, what do you think that churches can do to make sure that they feel like they're being more inclusive?
Yeah, so church is a funny animal in that everything comes down to context, right? So like contextualization of what's taking place in your house of worship is truly important. And if you are opening your doors on Sunday and geographically who surrounds your church is not walking through those doors, there's something that you're not doing correctly. Mm-hmm. Right? And what that means is that the sound and the messaging that's coming out of your house of worship on a Sunday is not reaching those people. And it could be because you're not leaving the building to go down the block and talk to that individual, or it could be what's taking place inside culturally does not resonate with them. And so you need to be making sure that wherever your church is positioned, because churches are very much place-based, that what's taking place inside of that building sounds like the music that's coming from the apartment building next door. That the language that you're speaking is something that the people around that space can resonate with. But it has to be genuine, it has to be top down. And like people want to come into the space and see people that look like them. And a couple resources I think for people to pick up on to read in church context is 2 books. One is The Cross and the Lynching Tree by Dr. James Cone. Bless his soul, God rest his soul. And then also Christian Imagination, which is Theology and Origins of Race. And that's by Dr. Willie James Jennings, who's actually a native of Grand Rapids, taught at Duke for a long time and is now at Yale. And so those are.
Oh. Sorry, George, I think you accidentally got muted there.
Yeah.
But I think that was really beautiful what you said of being, church and Christian outside of the building. I felt that touched me. But thank you again so much, George. And we're going to have Sarah introduce
yourself, and knowing that you will not be all that you think you can be for your child. And 2, that Black-brown child will have a very different reality and understanding and have to figure out how to navigate this life in a very different way than you have as a white male or female.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Courtney, I don't know if you have other questions. There was one that came up in terms of why is Sunday still the most segregated day of the week? How can churches become more diverse and intentional? Did you answer that one, George?
Yeah, I did hear George speak on that a little bit, but if you had any extra comments that you'd like to share.
Yeah, I think a lot of times the reason for it is that faith and church has always been a place of refuge, right, for people, and specifically for people of color. And so I think there is a level of comfort, there is a level of necessity to worship in a context that is familiar to you, and that is not devaluing any other multicultural context. I think what we need to examine too is that I think we're in a space in church culture where people are touting being multicultural, and it's like, oh, we have this, we have that, but really those spaces are not multicultural. They might be multi-ethnic. Right? There might be the one Indian family, there might be the one Black family or 20 Black families, there is representation. But unless we're in a place that how worship is expressed culturally in those separate contexts can be respected and engaged with in that particular space, then it is essentially not multicultural. It is purely only multi-ethnic. And so I don't foresee there ever being a time where Sunday will be segregated, because the reality is that as a Black person, I want to come into a worship space. I want to worship God in a way that reflects the traditions of my culture and my people. And also part of that narrative is separate, because it's separate from the majority, because that is a place of refuge from the oppression, or has been a place of refuge from the oppression, of white people. And typically when we're talking about Sunday being the most segregated hour, it is typically the white voice that is speaking to that and saying, we want more diversity in our space. But the question is, are you willing to go into the other space? It's always people of color coming into the white space to make it diverse. But very rarely is it the white person going into the space of a person of color and subscribing and ascribing to that particular worship environment. And so that is the call. That is the way forward in terms of the desire to see Sunday not be segregated. The call is on the majority community to go into the spaces of color and to sit under that leadership and under that worship style and under those cultural expressions of worship within those spaces.
I just think it's fair to say also, not only just in churches, but like in general, we need.
Correct.
Yeah.
Across the board. Yeah. And this is not just in churches at all.
Barbershops.
I completely agree. Yeah. Barbershops, skating rinks, so forth and so on. I think I've had that experience, right? Like this duality of engaging and being in both spaces. When I grew up, going to Oakdale Christian with Pete and Jeremy and some others, it was always me going into a white space, but very rarely were parents willing to allow their white child to come into my Black space, whatever that meant. Basketball games, you name it. And that needs to change.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah, very good.
A lot of that, I was just like, like it hit on so many points. But we did have one question